We are continuing to discover how the American Revolutionary War began in 1775. We are inching our way there. We have talked about the French and Indian War and the taxes that resulted. That was on page 4 and page 5. Now we're going to switch over onto page 6, and you will find these notes in your packet. Again, you will want them trimmed down so that you are able to tape them onto the page at the top. Now, as we discuss the Boston Massacre, you will be needing to fill in these blanks. All of this information will be specifically given in this lesson as you go along. It is your job to fill in those blanks. So to take the notes, you should be able to see the main ideas. Here are the letters, and then you'll get a little bit of a detail about each of those main ideas. That's how outlines are organized. With that in mind, I'm going to take you back to what we talked about, the French and Indian War. The result of the French and Indian War was England was in debt. They owed a lot of money, and so they decided the colonies should help pay the taxes to pay back that debt. One way to get the colonists to pay taxes was a Stamp Act. The colonists rebelled, and so the Stamp Act was repealed. But Mother England decided, nope, that wasn't enough. The Parliament and King George agreed to pass the Townshend tax. It was a law. It taxed fabric, tea, lead, and sugar, and it sent more soldiers to the colonies to collect those taxes. The next thing we will talk about is the Boston Massacre. You should have seen that at the top of the notes. Now, before we get too far in this, I would like you to jot down off to the side on page 6. A massacre is when a large number of living creatures are killed without a chance to fight back. So I want you to jot down off the side just a bit of a prediction. The name of this event is the Boston Massacre. Obviously, it's going to happen in Boston. If it's a massacre, how many people do you think are going to be massacred? How many innocent people do you think are going to be killed at Boston? This picture might help you. This is a reenactor. People who love history dress up as people from different time periods, and this fellow reenacts as if he is a British soldier. This is exactly what the uniforms of those soldiers sent to the colonies to make sure these new taxes were collected. This is what their uniforms looked like. This was their musket. It's not a rifle. We'll talk about that a little bit later. It's a musket. And this part is a sharp three-cornered blade called a bayonet. And you can see how long the bayonet is. This fellow was doing a presentation at when I got to go to Lexington and Concord and Boston and see those original stamps and so forth. So I got to walk up to this. From the tip of this bayonet to where it hooked in, it was as long as my arm from elbow to fingertip. So you're not talking just a little pocket knife. Those British soldiers had been sent to Boston and other English colonies to enforce the Townshend Acts, to collect those taxes. And those soldiers had been around for 2 years by the time we get to the Boston Massacre happening. Remember, you have to get some dates and some blanks filled in. The Revolutionary War technically starts in 1775, so that's 5 years from now. But this is part of the beginning. So those British soldiers had been in Boston for 2 years. And then we get to the evening of March 5th, 1770. There were 8 British soldiers on guard duty. Are in the military, it's called sentry duty. So they were guarding the place where the taxes had been collected. And you'll see a picture of that building in a moment with me standing in front of it because, I've been there. That night, a crowd started taunting them. And yeah, this is the same kind of taunting that we think of when bullies are picking on people. In this case, it doesn't seem like the British soldiers are the bullies. There's only 8 of them, and you have a crowd of colonists, sons of liberty, people who had been down working at the docks and they were on their way home after a long, hard day's labor. As well as taunting the soldiers, this crowd was throwing snowballs and garbage at them. You have to understand, back in this time period, there's no garbage pickup. You would throw your rotten food and your dirty dishwater and your indoor toilet stuff out into the street. There would be ditches alongside the street that flowed down to the water, and that made really handy stuff to get picked up and thrown at these soldiers. It was March 5th, so it was cold and everything was still frozen. Soon it became not enough to just throw the snowballs. These colonists were actually leaning up against the ends of the guns and daring these British soldiers to shoot. Now that seemed safe enough because at this point in time, soldiers in armies, and England had the best army in the world. The reason they were the best is because the soldiers were trained to follow orders. These soldiers did not act unless they were given an order. And the colonists knew that the soldiers that were standing on guard duty, their orders were just to stand guard. Unless an officer gave them the order to shoot their weapons, these British soldiers just had to stand there and take it. So this is the building that they were standing in front of. And these cobblestones mark the spot where the Boston Massacre happened. Now, I went to Boston a few years ago, so that's why my hair is a little bit different and I was still wearing contacts and so forth. Focus on the idea that this place still exists. You can go stand here. It's a little dangerous. The traffic is really quite busy in this area. And yet, these people are crossing right now, but there were a couple cars that came kind of close when I ran across to get to this spot. But hey, I got my picture taken in the spot where the Boston Massacre happened. Now, you have to imagine all of these other buildings gone. There were, however, other buildings nearby that were this size, but most buildings in Boston at this time were built out of wood. Not many of them would have been built out of brick. Because the customs house was so important and it was a place that was used to store tax money, it was built out of brick. So, in Boston and in all Maine towns, fire was a very, very big concern. Now, it sounds like I've changed the topic, right? But I didn't. It's going to fit together. At this time period, as soon as a fire happened, you would not, if you were the first person, you would not run to the fire. You would run to the nearest church and ring the church bell. Everyone who heard the church bell, if it was just ringing over and over and over again, they realized that was the signal there was a fire. All houses at this time had a fire bucket close to the front door. As soon as you heard that church bell ringing, you grabbed your fire bucket and ran to wherever everybody else was running. And in the meantime, they would be hollering about the fact that there's a fire so that they could get more people to carry more buckets of water to try to put the fire out before the whole town burns down. What does that have to do with this? Well, right around the time when the colonists were taunting these British soldiers, throwing snowballs and garbage at them, leaning on the gun muzzles and daring them to shoot, a church bell rings. And colonists, hey, that means there's a burning building, so they started yelling fire. What's wrong with that? Do you want to guess the one-word order that these British soldiers were trained to listen for in order to, in order to pull the trigger to shoot their weapon? The one word that ordered them to pull the trigger was fire. And so the soldiers thought this was an order. They fired into the crowd and they killed 7 people. This is the Boston Massacre. 7 people are killed. Interesting detail, one of the first people killed in the American War for Independence, the War for Freedom from England, one of the first people killed was a former slave. His name was Crispus Attucks. What happened after that? Well, the soldiers were put on trial. The soldiers who were at the Boston Massacre were put on trial. They were defended by John Adams. John Adams was the cousin of Sam Adams, who started the Sons of Liberty, and who a lot of people are pretty sure was the force behind the Boston Massacre even happening. But John Adams and Sam Adams also, and most of the colonists who were rebelling against England, they thought it was very important to make a statement that they believed in the rule of law, and that because these soldiers thought they heard the order to shoot their weapons, that the soldiers had done nothing wrong. And in fact, after the trial, 6 of the 8 soldiers were acquitted. The court agreed that 6 of those soldiers did nothing wrong. 2 were found guilty of manslaughter, which means they didn't murder. It's kind of worse than self-defense, but definitely nowhere near as bad as murder. Their punishment was to be branded on their thumbs. The other result, the other consequence of the Boston Massacre, British soldiers were sent out of the town of Boston. This star is meant to mark the spot where Crispus Attucks fell. So this is in the middle of those cobblestones that I was standing on. And we will end with a video reenacting the Boston Massacre.
The investigation into the Boston Massacre begins here on Boston Common. To separate truth from propaganda, we asked actors to reenact the events based on eyewitness statements.
We need this much space to make this line.
Reenactments of eyewitness accounts may show us if the events were physically possible.
When you come in as a mob, you're going to actually be close.
We hope to discover where different sets of testimony agree and where they diverge.
These bayonets are going to be down live steel. You cannot let your attention drift from the bayonets.
The forensic team can focus on the places where the witness statements differ.
Now bring him to the pulpit.
The shooting involved 8 British enlisted men and 1 officer. The actors portraying the soldiers have reproduced as accurately as possible the uniforms and weapons of the period, including this brown Bess musket. As night falls, the actors gather in front of the old State House. The busy city street has been blocked for the reenactment of the Boston Massacre, where it occurred long ago.
Turn her right about. Right?
The weather on the night of the reenactment is moderate, but on March 5th, 1770, the temperature was unusually cold, well below freezing, with a blanket of icy snow covering the ground. That evening, a British sentry, Private Hugh White, was guarding the customs house located here. Around 8 p.m., a young apprentice, Edward Garrick, began to taunt White. The taunting continued until White struck Garrick with the butt of his musket. Garrick fell to the ground. Word of the incident swept through the town. A swarm of angry citizens descended on the square. Many of them had been drinking in the local taverns. The crowd surrounded the sentry and threatened him with bodily harm. While the entire town appeared to be erupting, Captain Thomas Preston was in the main barracks across the street from the old State House, close enough to hear Sentry White call for help. Captain Preston marched in with 6 privates and a corporal. The British rescue team reached White and attempted to escort him back to the barracks, but they were stopped by a mob of up to 300 angry citizens. Hemmed in by the crowd, Preston ordered his troops into a semicircle formation and took a position in front of his men. Several people in the crowd dared the soldiers to shoot, yelling fire over and over.
It made the British soldiers feel like they didn't have any courage. You know, they're wanting the fire. They're wanting to answer that call, but they can't. And the crowd knows they can't, so they're daring them.
The demonstration turned lethal when Patriot Richard Palms struck a soldier, Private Montgomery, with a stick. Montgomery fell to the ground, then rose up and fired.
Now you'll notice this is different from the way I told you. As you dig into history and you find important events like this, you will find that the primary sources, the people who were there, tell the stories differently. So they have chosen here with the Discovery Channel, they have chosen different primary sources. To me, the primary sources that they chose don't make as much sense as the ones I chose.
The Boston Massacre began moments later. The other soldiers let loose a fusillade of musket fire. 11 colonials fell.
Once they had fired, the mob retreated. So the soldiers reloaded their weapons, and as the mob had come back in to retrieve their wounded, the soldiers thought that the mob was advancing on them to do them harm. They leveled their muskets at the crowd as if to fire again. When Preston saw this, he immediately knocked up their muzzles, yelling, "Don't fire, stop, don't fire." Preston ordered the men into a column of 2s and then marched them back to the main guard.
Paul Revere, Samuel Adams, and other Patriot leaders quickly claimed that the violent confrontation had been a massacre, a symbol of British tyranny, and they demanded justice. Captain Preston claimed that the shootings had been a tragic accident, but to no avail. On March 13th, Preston and 6 of the 8 enlisted men were indicted for murder. The lawyer defending the British soldiers was John Adams, the same man who would become America's second president. The trial hinged on this question: had the British soldiers acted in self-defense, or did they commit murder?
And that is where that one ends. Now, for your assignment, you have this picture and it needs to be colored. What am I looking for? No scribbles. It needs to be neat. You need to actually color the individual people. You can see how these colonists back here, I colored each fellow differently. I would have colored the hats differently as well. There's another colonist. You can't just color crosswise and say, oh, yep, they're colored. The houses and the buildings, the house would be brown because it's wood. This building here would be brick. Here you have the cobblestones, so they are brown. This is a leather pack holding the ammunition, so it's brown. The coats are very red. This fellow's sash could be whatever color you want it. He's the officer holding his sword up and giving the order. The socks, this is just plain white socks. These parts would be brown. That's called the gaiter. The boots then underneath are black. So those are the questions that I am asked the most about these. The hair could be gray. It was also powdered, so it would be white. So I am looking for you to have things colored individually and separately. It must be accurate. No white space, well, except the white hair and the white socks, like I said. You may only use colored pencils. So this picture must get colored and taped in onto page 7 of your booklet. There will be a bit of other work to do with the Boston Massacre, but that is your beginning.